Good afternoon. Today, you're here with Esme Chan and Kira Bragdon, and we'll be talking about the Civil War, and specifically the Freedmen's Bureau.
The American Civil War is a result of mass sectionalism between the North and South leading up to conflict in 1861 and 1865. The primary reasons behind the war were disagreements over states' rights and slavery. Northern victory in the war preserved the United States as one nation and ended the institution of slavery that divided the country from its beginnings. However, these achievements came at the cost of 625,000 lives. The American Civil War was the largest and most destructive conflict in the Western world between the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and the onset of World War I in 1914.
The Union victory in the Civil War in 1865 may have given some 4 million slaves their freedom, but the process of rebuilding the South during the Reconstruction period introduced a new set of significant challenges. Under the administration of President Andrew Johnson in 1865 and 1866, new Southern state legislators passed restrictive black codes to control the labor and behavior of former slaves and other African Americans.
The Freedmen's Bureau was established in March of 1865 to help freed people achieve economic stability and secure political freedoms following the Civil War. Nearly 4 million slaves gained their freedom after the Union victory, thus destroying the South's plantation-based economy. The Freedmen's Bureau provided food, housing, medical aid, established schools, and offered legal assistance. It also attempted to settle former slaves on Confederate lands confiscated or abandoned during the war. Nearly 900 Bureau agents essentially worked as social workers and were frequently the only federal representatives in Southern communities trying to help organize war-torn towns.
The period after the Civil War, in 1865 to 1877, was called the Reconstruction period. Abraham Lincoln started planning for the reconstruction of the South during the Civil War as Union soldiers occupied huge areas of the South. The Freedmen's Bureau took place within this era. Originally supposed to be named the Emancipation Bureau, this bureau was approved by Congress and Lincoln, and headed by General Olive O. Howard, who had fought in the Civil War battles, giving the bureau a one-year charter.
Congress gave land to freed men, but then took it away after the bureau was ended. The bureau tried, with little success, to promote land redistribution. However, most of the confiscated or abandoned Confederate land was eventually restored to the original owners, so there was little opportunity for black land ownership, which was seen as means to success in society.
The Freedmen's Bureau was an organization that tried to accomplish many things for freedmen after the Civil War, but most important duties of the Bureau was to try to bring relief work for both blacks and whites in war-stricken areas, support of better education system for blacks, administration of justice in cases concerning blacks, clinics and hospitals for former slaves, and distribution of food and clothing by the federal government to freed slaves and Southern white refugees. Ultimately, the main goal of the Bureau was to ease the transition from slavery to freedom and provide freed slaves with the proper institutions for success as they experienced freedom for the first time.
Now, before the end of the Civil War, the education of black slaves in the United States was a criminal act. Although efforts were made in the newly formed free black communities to organize schools, few African Americans received any education at all before the Reconstruction era, when public schools were opened. Even then, establishments for black children were poorly financed and largely ignored. Although the Bureau did not directly hire teachers, they assisted aid societies in meeting the demand for education.
Positive effects of the Bureau included presenting questions about the role of the federal government in establishing and maintaining racial and economic equality in the United States. It also had if it had not been created by Congress, it would have left many African Americans and poor Southerners to die of starvation, medical illness, or even due to the lack of shelter. African Americans were becoming literate, they had homes and jobs, and starvation became a rare occurrence. However, the Bureau did not last long, and much of the work they did was either reversed or revoked after the Bureau was shut down.
On July 25, 1868, a bill was signed into law requiring the withdrawal of most Bureau officers from the states and to stop the functions of the Bureau, except those that were related to education and claims. As Congress experienced irrational pressure from white Southerners, they went forward to dismantle the Freedmen's Bureau in 1872. The Bureau failed to make a real stride towards racial equality, mostly due to the fight between Congress and the president, as well as subpar funding. Many white Southerners, as well as President Andrew Johnson, challenged the Bureau's legitimacy, sparking racial violence in the South and the ultimate failure of the Bureau.
While the direct impacts of the Bureau may have been short-lived, the legacy helped pave the way for the civil rights movement as well as Jim Crow laws in the South.
If you were part of the Freedmen's Bureau, what aspect would you focus on and why?
If I was a part of the Freedmen's Bureau and I was working to help the freed slaves become accustomed to the new freedom that they had just acquired, I would focus on the land distribution. Land was seen as a sign of success in the 1800s, and thus having a piece of property that you would call your own would signify and boost your social ranking.
Do you think the efforts of the Freedmen's Bureau were effective or not?
I would consider the efforts of the Freedmen's Bureau not very effective because although they wanted to do good things for the freed slaves, they didn't achieve many long-lasting results. If the Bureau was more widespread and had a more overall support from President Johnson, maybe they would have had more accomplishments.
What do you think the impact of the Freedmen's Bureau would have been if not withdrawn by Congress?
If Congress and President Johnson had supported the freed slaves more, the results of the Bureau would have been very different. It could have changed the circumstances later on during the civil rights movement, as well as basic rights directly from the Civil War.
If you were part of the Freedmen's Bureau, what aspect would you focus on and why?
Well, I think based on their mission, we both kind of decided that after they've already replaced what they're missing and helped people get out of certain circumstances, I think the most important thing would be education, because especially in my field, that's something that I find very important, and that's the first thing to go when there's struggle and strife involved.
I said education because I think like in order to progress and like change anything, you need to learn about, where your people have been. And you need to like have a grasp on everything so you don't go into the world like being ignorant or like thinking you're entitled, because you're able to learn and adjust to each situation as you go.
And also, you don't want to perpetuate the problem, right? So once you have gotten out of a certain circumstance, you want to be able to be a source of change instead of a source of recapitulating the problem.
If you were part of the Freedmen's Bureau, what aspect would you focus on and why?
Education, and not just education of the young, but as the education of the group of freed slaves as a whole. One of the interesting things is when you have a population with a lower literacy rate, you can think of a non-standard way of teaching. So instead of just teaching the young, for instance, you could teach older people who might be involved in childcare, like a grandmother or grandfather, where the parents will be working. So if you educate both the old and the young at the same time, you'll have the older people reinforcing ideas. And the other really cool thing that can happen, then those two groups can then teach the working families or the working parents when they're home. So it's kind of an interesting way to bring it in. But yes, definitely education.